Welcome to my channel. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, a quiet escape tucked deep in the trees, far enough from the city that the air smelled of pine, and the only sounds at night were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of owls. It wasn't grand or flashy, and that was exactly why it meant so much. For years, it had been my sanctuary, a place where I could shut off the noise of daily life, sip coffee on the porch, and watch the sunrise crawl through branches. But even sanctuaries aren't immune to intrusion. It started with a letter, a thick, official-looking envelope with a return address of the local Homeowners Association. At first, it didn't concern me much. The HOA usually sent seasonal notices, reminders about snow shoveling, guidelines for firewood stacking, or newsletters filled with smiling stock photos of families enjoying community living. But this letter was different. Inside was a printed notice that jolted me upright. According to the HOA, my cabin had been listed for sale without the board's approval. They claimed they had received inquiries from prospective buyers and that I was in violation of community policy by failing to notify the association of property market activity. The words were underlined, bolded, and stamped with a warning that further noncompliance could result in fines. The problem was, I hadn't listed my cabin. I hadn't contacted an agent. I hadn't placed an ad, made a call, or even hinted at the idea of selling. The cabin wasn't on the market, and it certainly wasn't up for sale. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. Maybe they had mixed up addresses. Maybe another property owner had listed their home, and someone in the office had made a simple mistake. But as I read the letter again, line by line, it became clear this wasn't an error. The HOA had specifically referenced my property number, my lot description, and even the small details about my cabin's appearance. I set the letter down and looked around. The cabin hadn't changed. The porch still sagged slightly at one end, the window shutters still needed repainting, and the gravel driveway still bore the marks of last winter's snow tires. Nothing about it screamed for sale. Still, a creeping unease settled in. Someone, somewhere, was treating my home as if it belonged to them. The letter ended with a directive. I was required to attend the next HOA meeting to discuss the situation and resolve any misunderstandings. The phrasing made it sound diplomatic, but I knew the HOA style well enough by now. They never sent letters unless they believed they already had the upper hand. I folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. The silence of the cabin felt heavier than usual, as though the trees themselves were leaning closer, listening. For years, this place had been mine alone, untouched, unbothered, unclaimed by anyone else. Now, with a single letter, the HOA was suggesting otherwise. I didn't know yet how far they would go, or how tangled this web of assumptions and false claims would become. All I knew, sitting there with a letter in hand, was that I would not let them strip me of what was mine. And so began the fight. The following week, the HOA gathered in the community lodge, a building that looked far more polished than most of the homes it presided over. Fresh paint, new shingles, bright flags fluttering in the breeze. This was the HOA's monument to its own authority. I arrived early, letter in hand, ready to clear up what I assumed was a misunderstanding. But when I walked inside, it was clear that this was not going to be a quick clarification. The meeting room was already filled with board members seated behind a long wooden table. Their folders were stacked high, their pens aligned, their expressions carefully neutral. On the wall behind them hung a banner that read, "Preserving our community values." The message, in bold serif letters, had always felt more like a warning than a mission statement. When my turn came, they didn't begin with questions. They began with accusations. The chairperson slid a packet across the table toward me. Inside were printed screenshots of online real estate listings that showed photographs of my cabin, my porch, even the interior walls. The descriptions promised a charming rustic retreat in a desirable location, complete with square footage, estimated value, and a realtor's contact information. The room seemed to tilt. Someone, somewhere, had created a full listing for my property, complete with details they could have only known by trespassing. The photos weren't generic stock images. They were mine. Angles I recognized, corners I had painted myself, the old stone fireplace I had cleaned just months earlier. The board members didn't ask if I knew anything about it. They assumed I was behind it. They claimed I had broken protocol by listing without HOA approval, accused me of attempting to bypass community regulations, and warned me of mounting fines if I continued to ignore procedures. I tried to explain that I had never put the cabin on the market, but the silence that followed was thicker than disbelief. It was a kind of silence that carried judgment, the kind that said they had already decided on their narrative and anything I said was just noise. As I left the meeting, I could feel their eyes on me, following me to the door, weighing me down with suspicion. Outside, the late evening air was cool, but I was burning with frustration. It wasn't just a false claim that unsettled me. It was the fact that someone had invaded the privacy of my cabin to stage the illusion of a sale. On the drive back, the road winding between shadow trees, I replayed the evidence in my mind. Screenshots, listings, photos from inside my cabin. Someone had gone to great lengths to fabricate this, and the HOA had taken their side without hesitation. What began as a letter had now escalated into something darker, a coordinated effort to convince me, and perhaps everyone else, that my home no longer belonged to me. That night, as the crickets chirped outside and the cabin groaned with its usual nighttime creaks, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the printed listing I had taken from the meeting. The ink smelled fresh, the paper still warm from the copier. They thought they had caught me in a lie. But what they didn't realize was that this fight had only just begun. The morning after the meeting, the unease lingered like smoke. I couldn't shake the image of those printed screenshots, my cabin reduced to a product, stripped of its quiet dignity, and paraded online like a prize. Someone had trespassed. Someone had walked through my space, taken those photos, and handed them to the world as though the cabin were theirs to sell. The HOA's arrogance was one thing, but the thought of strangers inside my sanctuary gnawed at me more than their accusations ever could. I started with the listing itself. Pulling up the website, I typed the details into the search bar. There was my cabin under a realtor's name I didn't recognize. The photos were all too familiar. The crooked lamp in the living room, the dented kettle by the stove, the coat rack by the door. They weren't staged shots. They were stolen moments of my life. I clicked through the images one by one, noting the angles, trying to remember if I had left the curtains open, if I had accidentally allowed someone to see inside. But some of the shots were taken from vantage points that made no sense. A corner of the bedroom where only someone standing inside the room could have taken the picture. A view of the back hallway where no window faced. Whoever had taken these photos hadn't just peered in. They had entered. The listing itself gave little away. The realtor's contact information was generic. A phone number that went straight to voicemail, an email address without a company logo, and no office listed. I copied it all down, but it reeked of a shell identity, something made just convincing enough to pass as real. Next, I began asking around. In small communities like ours, word spreads quickly. If someone thought my cabin was for sale, surely a neighbor had heard whispers. At first, people were polite, cautious, their smiles a little too forced when I brought up the subject. But by the third conversation, the pattern became clear. Several neighbors admitted they had seen unfamiliar cars parked near my property. A silver SUV, a black sedan, even a delivery van that stayed longer than seemed normal. The realization hit hard. Not only had someone been inside, but they had been making regular visits, all while I remained unaware. That night, I walked the perimeter of the cabin with a flashlight. The gravel crunched underfoot, the trees swayed, and every shadow seemed alive. Near the side window, I noticed something odd. Faint marks on the frame, like scratches where a tool might pried it open. My stomach sank. The violation was no longer just speculation. It was real. I began piecing the puzzle together. Someone had broken in, photographed my home, and created a listing. The HOA, instead of treating me as a victim, had decided I was a culprit. And now, with every conversation I had with neighbors, it seemed more likely that others were beginning to believe the story the HOA was feeding them. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about control. If they could convince enough people that I had put the property up for sale, then my voice, my protests, would be drowned out by the weight of evidence. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the printed screenshots on my kitchen table. The cabin felt different now, less like a sanctuary, more like a crime scene. And with that thought came a decision. If the HOA wanted to treat me like I was hiding something, then I would dig deeper than they ever expected. I would find out who staged the sale, and I would do it on my terms. The cabin was mine, and I was going to prove it. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of whispered conversations, long nights of research, and restless mornings where the cabin seemed less like a retreat and more like a battlefield. The HOA's letter had been the spark, but the fire beneath it was starting to show. I began piecing together the subtle patterns of the association's behavior. It wasn't random, and it wasn't just about me. The lodge meetings, the community value speeches, the endless newsletters. Behind all of it was a growing push for what they called revitalization. They spoke of improving the neighborhood, attracting more families, and modernizing community image. On the surface, it sounded harmless, even optimistic. But beneath the shiny words lurked a single unspoken truth. The HOA wanted to clear out the old to make way for the new. My cabin, rustic and tucked in the woods, was the perfect target. It didn't fit their glossy brochures. It didn't look like the stage photos in their magazines. It was too real, too unpolished, too much a reminder of what the community used to be before the HOA took over. And then a pattern emerged. I started looking into other homeowners, neighbors who had left over the past 2 years. Each story carried the same eerie rhythm. Sudden disputes with the board, escalating fines, accusations of rule violations, and eventually a sale under pressure. Properties were snatched up, renovated, and resold at higher prices. The HOA always stood on the sidelines, arms folded, claiming they were only enforcing rules. But somehow, they always benefited from the turnover. The fake listing of my cabin wasn't just an error. It was a move, a calculated step in a larger game. I traced the fabricated realtor contact back to the phone number, running it through databases and reverse searches. What came back wasn't a legitimate business, but a disposable service. Numbers rented out for short periods, untraceable to an individual. But when I compared the email domain with community records, I found something chilling. The account had been registered using the same Wi-Fi network that the HOA Lodge used for its meetings. The realization hit me like ice water. The HOA wasn't just accusing me. They were behind the false listing themselves. It explained their eagerness to pin the blame on me, their unwillingness to listen, their smug certainty at the meeting. They agreed with the problem, then positioned themselves as the authority to solve it. And if I hadn't fought back, they might have forced me into a corner just like so many others before me. That night, I sat by the fireplace with the documents spread out in front of me, screenshots, notes, neighbor testimonies. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind outside, and I felt the full gravity of what I was up against. This wasn't about one letter. It was about an organization with power, connections, and a clear agenda to strip people of their homes in the name of profit. They thought the cabin was vulnerable, that I was just another name on their list. But they had underestimated how far I was willing to go. For the first time since the letter arrived, the fear inside me shifted into something sharper, steadier, a resolve. The HOA wanted a fight, and I was ready to give them one. The HOA had played their move. Now it was my turn. I knew I couldn't fight them with outrage alone. They thrived on it, twisting anger into non-compliance, and branding resistance as hostility. If I stormed into another meeting, they would bury me under their scripted smiles and piles of paperwork. No, the only way to win was to expose them on their own stage, in front of the same people they had been manipulating for years. So I set a trap. The first step was simple. I pretended to play along. I began leaving subtle hints that I might actually be considering selling. I spoke casually to a few neighbors, letting the words slip in as though I was testing the waters. I wanted the HOA to hear the whispers, to believe their plan was working. Sure enough, within days, I noticed a pattern. Another prospective buyer appeared. Someone who just happened to drive past my cabin more than once, lingering a little too long, jotting notes while parked at the edge of the road. It was staged, clumsy, but effective enough to convince anyone who didn't know better. The second step was surveillance. I installed small motion-activated cameras around the property, tucked in places that blended with the trees and shadows. At night, the woods lit up in quiet flashes. As deer wandered through, owls swooped, and wind shifted branches. But then one evening, the cameras caught something else. Two figures stepping out of a silver SUV, walking straight to my porch with flashlights. One of them carried a clipboard. The other took photos, new photos. They didn't see the tiny lens watching them, recording their every move. The third step was documentation. I took the footage, the fabricated listings, and the records of disposable phone numbers and email domains, and I assembled them into a neat, undeniable packet. Every detail tied back to the HOA's network. Every breadcrumb led straight to their door. And then came the final step. Timing. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, in the same lodge where they had accused me weeks before. I showed up early, not with frustration burning in my chest this time, but with calm certainty. The board members sat in their polished row, their folders stacked neatly as always. Their banner still proclaimed, "Preserving our community values," though now the words read to me like a confession rather than a motto. When my turn came to speak, I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I presented. First, a screenshot to the listing. Then the discovery that the email address was linked to their own Wi-Fi. Then, without raising my voice, I played the footage on a small projector. The grainy video showed two individuals trespassing on my property, shining their flashlights across my porch, photographing the cabin that was supposed to be for sale. The room went silent. Not the heavy silence of suspicion this time, but the stunned silence of realization. Neighbors leaned forward, whispers spreading like ripples. The board members' carefully neutral expressions cracked. Eyes narrowing, lips tightening, paper shuffling. The trap had been sprung. For the first time, the HOA wasn't in control of the narrative. I was. The silence after the footage ended was sharper than any words could have been. For a moment, no one moved. The projector screen glowed faintly with the final frozen frame of two trespassers caught in the act, faces partially visible, enough to be recognized. It didn't take long for the whispers to shift into something louder. Neighbors who had once eyed me with suspicion were now turning their attention toward the board. Questions flew across the room. Who were those people? Why were they on my property? Why was the fake listing tied to the HOA's own network? The board members shifted in their seats, their polished composure unraveling. The chairperson tried to regain control, clearing his throat and insisting it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps these were overzealous agents acting independently. But the room wasn't buying it anymore. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. One of the neighbors spoke up, a man who had quietly sold his house a year before under suspicious circumstances. His voice cracked as he admitted that he, too, had felt pressured, watched, cornered by sudden fines and vague accusations until selling seemed like the only option. Another neighbor followed, then another, until the entire room swelled with stories of intimidation and quiet manipulation. The HOA's polished image cracked wide open. What had once looked like professionalism now looked like a scheme, one that had been running far longer than anyone realized. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply laid out the final pieces. The trespassing evidence had already been shared with law enforcement, the fraudulent listing reported to the Real Estate Commission, and the entire packet of documentation sent to a lawyer who specialized in HOA misconduct. The board froze. For years, they had operated like untouchable kings of the neighborhood, but now the ground beneath them was shifting. Their banner still hung behind them, preserving our community values, but its words had turned into a cruel irony. Neighbors who had once nodded along with their authority now looked at them with narrowed eyes, their trust shattered. The balance of power had flipped in a single evening, and there was no going back. By the following week, the fallout spread quickly. 2 board members resigned under pressure. Investigators began digging into financial records, tracing patterns of property flips and suspicious transfers. Rumors swirled that fines collected over the years hadn't gone where they were supposed to. What had started as a single letter in my mailbox had unraveled into a scandal that reached far deeper than anyone imagined. And my cabin, my quiet refuge in the woods, stood untouched, unlisted, unclaimed by anyone but me. The morning after the storm broke, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist lift through the trees. The silence felt different now, lighter, free of the shadow that hovered over me since the first notice arrived. The HOA had thought they could write my story for me, that they could decide the fate of my home without my consent. But they had underestimated one simple truth. The cabin wasn't just a piece of property. It was part of me, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it. As the sun broke through the branches, I folded the last copy of the letter they had sent me and tucked it away, not as a reminder of fear, but as proof of what happens when ordinary homeowners push back. The HOA had thought my cabin was on the market, but I proved beyond a doubt that it wasn't going anywhere. Please like and subscribe to my channel.